thank you very much for coming. And I'm conscious that there are some people downstairs who've only got the television screen, so I'll hope to be able to let them have a word with me afterwards, because they don't have a direct feedback mechanism. Now, it's very difficult to select 6 books that have particularly influenced you. I'm going to stick to the first 1100 years of Western philosophy, because ancient Greek philosophy is a very large proportion of Western philosophy. It is the first 1100 years of Western philosophy, starting at 500 BC, but I'll confine myself to that period, or else it would be hopeless trying to stick to 6. And I'm not going to say which are the most important 6 books in those 1100 years, only the ones that have been most seminal for me. In a way, my selection of 6 will give you examples of philosophy which will help you to answer the question what philosophy is, because I think that's best answered by looking at examples of philosophy. And I'll ask you to think, which are your favourite aspects of philosophy? Perhaps the simplest thing is to ask you, which of my 6 you feel you'd like best? Those of you who've come at all regularly will know a little bit about them already. Some people may be here this evening for the first time. Well, then, on that small basis, I'll ask you to be thinking which of my 6 you like best. And then we might have a little discussion at the end about the different aspects of philosophy and which ones interest you most. Now, it would be absurd if anybody were talking about the most important books in these 1100 years to leave out Plato in the 4th century BC in Athens. But I am actually not going to start with Plato. I'm going to start with his great pupil Aristotle. This is no comment whatsoever on which was the greatest of these 2 giants. You couldn't have had Aristotle without Plato, and they had complementary talents. Plato, the imaginative one; Aristotle, the one who liked to get everything sewn up. It just happens that, for temperamental reasons probably, Aristotle's had more influence on me. And if I had to choose one book, I'd choose Aristotle's Physics. A lot of the 6 books I've mentioned can be got most easily in the series of little books printed in red and green. I've got a lot on the desk there, called the Lerb series. I mention that both because they're in a lot of public libraries and because even nowadays they're not so terribly expensive. Aristotle's Physics, it's well worn so the backs have come off, because it's in Greek, is in green. And that's the whole of his physics. And these books have got the Greek or the Latin on one side, so the English is only half. If I had to choose one part of Aristotle's Physics, I'd choose book 2, which is less than half of that book. Why? Well, in book 2 of the Physics, Aristotle, Plato's pupil in the 4th century BC, says there are 4 types of explanation. Cause is one type of explanation. I think that's a very important remark, because I think it deals with our fear that perhaps everything that happens, everything that's going to happen tomorrow, has been fixed by causes in advance. Whatever you do tomorrow has its causes, and those causes have earlier causes, and the chain of causes goes back to before you were born. So perhaps it's fixed what you're going to do tomorrow by these causes. And indeed, many, many philosophers nowadays wrestle with this because they think that what is caused is somehow necessitated, so that it is inevitable. But Aristotle didn't connect cause with necessitation. He connected with explanation. And I've argued that you can have absolutely perfect explanations which don't present the thing explained as inevitable. You don't have to do that in order to have a perfect explanation. So there's one way in weakening the fear that perhaps because everything's caused, everything's also fixed in advance. But Aristotle makes another point. He says it isn't even true that everything is caused. He hasn't quite reached this view when he wrote the physics, but he comes back to the subject in a later work, and he makes the following very clever point. It isn't true that everything's caused. Can you think of any examples of things which aren't caused? At least, it isn't true that everything's caused if a cause is an explanation, because not everything is explicable. Can you think of anything that isn't explicable? He gave a very simple, everyday example. Coincidences. What's a coincidence? Well, his example is, supposing a thirsty man goes to the well to get a drink after eating something spicy, some sort of Middle Eastern spice dish. So he's thirsty, so he goes to the well at 2 o'clock. There's a perfectly good explanation of why he goes there at 2 o'clock. Now, supposing the thugs go to the well at 2 o'clock as well, for a perfectly good reason, they were slung out of the pub. There's no mystery about why either of these things happened. Does it follow that there's a perfectly good explanation of why they went to the well at the same time? No, says Aristotle, and I agree. The fact that each event taken separately has a perfectly good explanation does not mean that the coincidence of them combining with each other has any explanation at all. As we say, there isn't an explanation, it was just a coincidence. Yet coincidences can have tremendous results. In this story, the result of the man being murdered by the thugs. So his first definition of the first type of explanation, cause, is very important for getting us out of the idea, oh dear, everything is caused, so everything is fixed. But he has 3 other types of explanation in this set of a dozen pages. What's called Book 2 isn't really, in our terms, a separate book. It's been called a book, but it's really a dozen pages of English. The second thing he says is, you must distinguish between material explanations and formal explanations, and the point I'm going to bring out of that is this. We live in a rather materialistic age, or at least the philosophers do, and they're often trying to tell you that if you got angry, the explanation is a physical one. Your nervous system was doing this, that, and the other, and so your adrenaline did this, that, and the other, and so you're angry. Well, Aristotle says that's all very important to know, and in abnormal cases, or unfortunate cases, that is enough to make you angry. But commonly, it isn't enough on its own. Commonly, you need to know, well, he thought he'd been snubbed. And by whom? That's the formal explanation. If you just stick to material explanations, says Aristotle, you won't completely explain, in most cases, for most purposes. I think that's an important point. And finally, his fourth type of explanation is purpose, and he thinks there's unconscious purpose in nature. He's the last person to think that there's a God who consciously planned nature, or that nature itself is conscious. No, he's talking about purpose in nature in the way biologists still do when they say things have a function. And that's why they're there. Aristotle didn't know about the heart pumping blood, but we might say some animals have a heart because it circulates the blood, and that's its purpose. Modern thinkers usually explain that when they've said purpose, they add on that natural selection has taken a hand. Aristotle knew all about natural selection, because one of his predecessors had postulated it. But still in this book too, he gives his reasons why he doesn't agree with natural selection. And actually, in a certain way, he's not wrong, because the version of natural selection which he was opposing had important holes in it. And he was right to reject that particular version. Of course, modern theories of natural selection are much more sophisticated, and he hadn't anticipated them. So there's 12 pages of English, in many translations it's 12 pages, which have these 4 types of explanation, tremendously important, I think, for explaining things in the physical world. And interestingly, he gives no argument whatever that there are these 4 explanations. He just says, see it like this. Now, I think very often great philosophers don't argue. They have enough originality and imagination to say, look, see it my way, and you'll find everything falls into place. And the test is not the arguments he's given to prove it, there are none, but whether it does make things fall into place, and in this case I think it often does. Now, that's the main thing I'll say. That's just, however, book 2. There are 8 so-called books in these little pages, these 2 little volumes, which would boil down to 1 volume if you only had the English. I'll just tell you what the whole book is about. The whole book is really about natural motion. And so he has, in discussing motion, also to discuss space, time, and infinity. And he has little puzzles about whether time is real. After all, the past no longer exists. The future doesn't yet exist. So what exists? The present. But how long is the present? A year? No. The later half of the year is future. The earlier half of the year is past. All that exists is a sizeless instant in the middle. So none of the real parts which add up to make time exist at all. Does time exist then? We'll come back to that in another author, in a very different context. Some of you know that Aristotle invented the idea of infinity, which is usually taught in schools these days. Don't be frightened by infinity, he says. It's not a more than finite number. When we talk of infinity, we just mean an ever-expandable finitude. That's much less frightening. Turns infinity into something finite. It works very well for some things. It enables him to say space is finite. It enables him to say the future is finite. Starting from now, you'll never reach a point where we have gone through a more than finite number of years from now. The one thing it doesn't fit nicely is the past. If, as Aristotle says, the universe had no beginning, then the universe ought to have gone through a more than finite number of years already by now. How does he deal with that? I think he tries to deal with it by saying, oh, look, it's all right, because there's only 1 year in existence at a time. You don't have a more than finite number of years because there's only 1 year in existence at any one time. I'm not sure if that will work, actually. After all, for one thing, he's already hinted to us that perhaps there isn't a whole year in existence, but only 1 instant. And for another thing, he doesn't really want a more than finite number, even of defunct years. He doesn't want a more than finite number of anything. So whether the years are defunct or not doesn't make much difference. One last thing, and then I'll leave the first book. He thinks he can answer Zeno's paradox, which some of you will know, that none of you can go home tonight because to reach the door, you'd first have to go halfway, then half the remaining distance, then half the remaining distance, and there'd be an infinity of sub-distances. How can you finish going right through a more than finite number? His answer is a slightly unexpected one. It is that you'll only have marked out in your mind, or by putting chalk marks on the floor, a finite number of distances, half distances. You can always add another one. You can add as large a finite number as you like, but the number will always remain finite. Once again, I'm not sure it's a good answer, because after all, he oughtn't to want to allow a more than finite number even of possible marking places, even of places where you could put down a marker in your thought. And yet there surely is a more than finite number of places between here and the door where you could put down your halfway markers. Nonetheless, he is the person who, above all, has made us think about infinity. That's enough for Aristotle. Now I'm going to cheat. I'm going to skip from the 4th century to the 1st century AD, but I couldn't bring myself to give you only one Stoic. So I'm going to give you a tiny little bit of 2 Stoics from the 1st century AD when the Roman Empire started. One of my 1st century AD Stoics is a Roman, one of the first people to write philosophy in Latin. Inspired by the Greek Stoics, he's writing in Latin. He writes some wonderful letters to a middle-class person who may be made up, all about how you shouldn't stay in the rat race if the rat race is too bad, or how to take retirement in an elegant way without making a fuss about it, early retirement I mean, or how not to get over-fussed about your health. It could all have been written today. I strongly recommend Seneca's letters, but I'm going to select a chapter from his On Anger. Now, Seneca was the tutor of the tyrant Nero, and eventually he was Nero's victim by suicide. Nero ordered him to commit suicide. Funnily, because in his letters and in his work on anger, he repeatedly says that suicide is a way of getting freedom from tyrants. The tyrant tells you to do so-and-so, or the tyrant, in one of his horrible stories, shoots your son while drunk, deliberately. What's the response? Anger gets you nowhere, but suicide always gives you freedom. In the end, he was forced to commit suicide. Now, in his book on anger, there are 4 pages in what's called Book 2 of On Anger, but it's tiny. It's only 4 pages in his moral essays. On Anger is one of the moral essays, 4 pages of Book 2, the first 4 pages of Book 2. The Stoics invented cognitive therapy, the idea that emotions, in their view, consist of evaluative judgments about, I'm in a terrible situation, or I'm in a wonderful situation, judgments about good and bad, which you could reassess. He distinguishes 3 stages in anger. First, it appears to you that things are good or bad. Now, you can't help mere appearance. Now, the mere appearance that things are good or bad can create physical symptoms. Your teeth can chatter, or you can go pale, or start crying, or whatever. Don't worry about that. You can't help that. You can't help the appearance of good or bad. You can't help the tears. But there's something you can help. You are free to reassess the appearance. Am I really in a bad position? The Stoics give you lots and lots of advice on how to reassess whether the position is really so bad when you take the long view. And that's why it's very typically your fault if you're full of anger or full of fear or full of other unwanted emotions. You fail to reassess. You may have failed even to realize you could reassess. You reassess by a cognitive therapy. Now, some of the ancient Greeks said, well and good as far as it goes, but there's a physical side to emotions. The greatest of all the Greek doctors, one of the greatest doctors who's ever lived, Galen, a bit later than the Stoics, in 200 AD, said, fine, I agree with all this cognitive therapy, but first come to me as a doctor and I'll change your diet. You've got to get the physical side right before the emotions come right. It's just been confirmed in Aylesbury prison. Because the prisoners behaved incredibly much better when given a decent diet. The Home Office still hasn't admitted it because it would be so expensive. But it's obviously true, as with many things in the ancient world, that they are waiting to be rediscovered. Now, my view is that both are important, but the Stoics thought you could do it all with cognitive therapy. One person had said, oh, look, this is all a bit intellectualist, you know. Emotions aren't just assessments of whether things are good or bad. There's non-intellectual drives. After all, when wordless music gives you a longing, that's not because you've altered your attitude. It's nothing to do with your thoughts or judgments or appearances. And animals aren't sophisticated enough to have thoughts about whether things are good or bad. And what about cases where you find yourself crying and are really distressed, even though you're disowning that there's anything bad? You're saying, I'm silly, there's nothing to cry about, and yet you're crying, you're distressed. These 3 cases were brought up against this Stoic account of emotions, but I think that what Seneca is doing is answering them, although he doesn't name his opponent, because he says, no, look, in all these cases, it's not real emotion. Where the judgment of good or bad is missing, so is the emotion. These are just the symptoms he talked about. The crying is just a symptom. Animals only have symptoms. It's not real emotions because they don't think that things are good or bad. And music only stirs up symptoms. It doesn't stir up thoughts about things being good or bad, says Seneca. In fact, the arts in general, drama, stories, none of the arts arouse real emotions. They only arouse what I was calling the symptoms. I don't agree with his theory, but it's a very interesting one. And I think it's why he didn't think it necessary to consider Aristotle's theory that the value of tragedy, and why any society needs theatres with tragedy, is that tragedy stirs up real emotions, and that helps to relieve you of them. Seneca doesn't have to address that because he doesn't think that theatre or any art stir up real emotions. They only stir up the symptoms, not the real thoughts. That's enough on Seneca. Now my other Stoic, because I'm cheating, is Epictetus, same 1st century AD, under the empire. Both suffered from the emperors. Epictetus was the opposite of the aristocratic Seneca. He was an ex-slave. He was started as a slave. He had his leg broken when he was a slave. He lived in Rome, like Seneca, but he was exiled by a later emperor. And he wrote these wonderful discourses. Just read the very first opening discourse, book 1, chapter 1. Tiny, just 2 or 3 pages. Again, in the Loeb edition, it's green. And he says, look, the way you would be free of tyrants, and they had all to think about tyrants in those days, is you've got to think of yourself and say to yourself, look, I am not my body, I am not my leg. The tyrant can put your leg in chains, but he can't put you in chains if you can bring yourself to believe that you are your will directed only to what's under your control. You've got to think out what's under your control, direct your will to that, and then say, I am my will, I'm not my leg. Then the tyrant is powerless. And you know this was done? This was done by Admiral Stockdale, the American war hero, whom I invited over to London, to King's College, to talk about how he survived 19 occasions of physical torture in Vietnam and 4 years of solitary confinement. It was fascinating talking to him and his wife, who didn't know where he was and whether he was alive, by following the recipes of Epictetus. Some of you have heard me at more length on this, but that's why I couldn't bear not to include a tiny bit of Epictetus with my 1st century Stoics. So that's number 2. I'll be quicker on the other 4. These ones you can get in the Loeb series. Aristotle, Seneca and Epictetus. But for my 3rd one, I'm moving forward in time. I'm moving forward. We've had the 4th century BC, we've had the 1st century AD. I'm moving forward to 300 AD. And this one was not easily available in translation until a year or so ago. This person in 300 AD, living now in Rome, though writing in Greek, because Rome had become so important, is the second of the Neoplatonists. His name is Porphyry, a great philosopher. And he wrote the most fascinating book on abstinence from killing animals. Gresham College has been supporting this work of translating these volumes, and we'll come to another one a little later on. Now, this is the fullest account in antiquity of the arguments both for and against killing animals, and it's as full an account of both sides of the story as you'd get nowadays, because most of them are on one side or the other. Now, Christianity hadn't quite taken over from paganism in 300 AD. It did in 325, but nobody could have predicted that in 300. The Christians were still the underdogs, and anyhow, there was a love-hate relationship between pagans and Christians for the next 300 years. And we'll see that, I think, in all my remaining examples. Porphyry questioned not only Christianity, but Greek religion and the increasingly popular Egyptian religion too, respectfully questioned, but very brilliantly. New Testament scholars accept his claim that one of the books of what we call, the Christians call, the Old Testament. He accepts Porphyry, they accept Porphyry's claim that when you date this properly, it can't be prophecy because it was written after the event. He was a very, very brilliant scholar as well as a philosopher, Porphyry. His Against the Christians, one of his books, was burnt twice, which shows that it didn't work the first time. Now, in this book, on abstinence from killing animals, pretty newly out, the purple book, it's a Duckworth book, he says that if you really understood gods, humans, and animals, you would realize there was no case for killing animals. First, the gods, they're not going to be pleased by your sacrificing animals to them. In the Greek world, sacrifice and eating were intimately connected. You didn't get one without the other. Until Christianity took over, that is, in the pagan Greek world. Now, humans. He goes through a fascinating anthropological account of many nations, including Hindus, he's got as far as India in his knowledge, who didn't find it necessary to eat animals, and they are perfectly flourishing communities. And you have more control over your emotions if you don't eat animals. Point that came up before with Galen, who was earlier than him in 200, not 300. And finally, if you understand animals, you'll understand two things. The debate so far had been a curious one because it was a debate about whether animals are rational or not. I think it's a slightly funny argument anyhow. They're not rational so we can eat them, even if it were true. I don't think it's true. But the Stoics had argued this way. The Stoics had said, rather anticipating Kant, they had said, look, there's a community of rational beings, and within that community, justice is owed. But animals, the Stoics said, are irrational, so they're not part of the community, so nothing you do to them is unjust. Well, Porphyry says, look, first, they are rational, and he gives a very nice argument, among many others. I recommend what's called Book 3. It's only 20 pages. I recommend Book 3 on abstinence from killing animals. He says, look, some animal pets understand their masters, and some of them even know Greek. That's more than we can say of everybody, I'm afraid. He gives many more arguments to show they're rational, but what's very unusual at this period is that he adds, and they suffer, which is surely very much more relevant than whether they're rational. He's one of the first. My friend Plutarch was one of the earlier ones. As I've got a tiny bit of time in hand, I will just say one more thing about Plutarch. Plutarch actually is earlier than Porphyry, but he also wrote, among many other things, about animals. He was the 1st century AD. He was a Platonist. And I think that his 15 little green books, called the Morals, the Latin is the Moralia, but he was writing in Greek, actually. I think it should be in every household which has young people growing up in it, because he tells you everything you ever wanted to know, but nobody else is going to tell you. How to avoid being obsequious, how to avoid being garrulous and using too many words. Do you know the shortest letter in history? Alexander's predecessor, Alexander the Great's predecessor, wrote to the Spartans and said, if we invade you, we'll chuck you out of your country. And the Spartans replied, if. All this wonderful advice for growing people, even for adult people actually, in Plutarch. Now, that was another little bit of cheating. Forget Plutarch. We're going to try and keep it as close to 6 as we can. Augustine's Confessions is the next one. The great Christian Augustine, who felt he owed everything to the pagan Platonists. And his Confessions are riveting. The title is not misleading. The great Henry Chadwick's translation is surely the most useful one to get, this very inexpensive one in the Oxford World's Classics. But there are lots of translations. It is a very good one. He says in his autobiography, The Confessions, that it was from the books of the Platonists, and we know which ones he means, that he learnt to look within in order to find truth and God. That was the Neoplatonist view of my friend Porphyry and the first Neoplatonist, Plotinus. You look within to find the truth and to find God. And at first, Augustine, who wasn't yet a Christian, saw no difference between Platonism and Christianity. Platonism was his route to being baptized as a Christian. He was against porphyry on animals because, after all, Christ was a meat-eater. So what Augustine had to do was to repeat the Stoic arguments. Animals are not part of the rational community, so we can kill them. Even though the Ten Commandments include "thou shalt not kill," this can't have been meant to apply to animals. He sides with the Stoics. He only read porphyry a little bit later, but he may have read porphyry by the time he wrote that. But he keeps quiet about porphyry's side of the argument, which is pro-animal. And he thought the Stoics were wrong, however, on another matter. He doesn't think that humans can achieve emotional control, and the Confessions is about that. Humans unaided by God, they can't achieve emotional control. The first 3 books about us are about a sinful childhood. Even a baby's crying is sinful. Those of us who have lived with babies know that after the first little while, that can be very true. It's sinful crying, really, but we all engaged in it. And he describes how he stole the pears, even though it is, in St. Paul's words, written in our hearts, a law against theft, a word used for natural law or law of nations, written in our hearts. Nonetheless, he stole the pears as a child, not because he wanted pears at all, but because it was such fun to be stealing them. We are basically sinful, and we can't get over these temptations unaided. The Stoics were so wrong. He used to go to the theatre. Theatres were terrible, awful sex shows. Some scholars have spent almost all their whole lives trying to work out what happened in these sex shows. But anyhow, it was very sinful. Take Augustine's word for it, even though it's not quite clear exactly what went on. He comments, by the way, that for all of Aristotle's, he doesn't mention Aristotle, for all of Aristotle's idea that pity in the theatre is a very good thing, it robs you of pity, he says it can't be real pity that you feel in the theatre, because you like to see these horrible things happening to people again and again and again. So it can't really be real pity. This is all about emotions. When a close friend died, he tells us now next in book 4, he was inconsolable. It's the most amazing description of inconsolable grief. He doesn't even name the friend. He realized later, he says, that without God you weren't going to control your grief. And then, most famously of all, perhaps, book 9, chapter 10, it's really only 2 pages. He describes how a week before his beloved mother's death, they were in Ostia, the harbour of Rome, together, and they discussed what the life of the saints might be like. And they thought of the beauties of the world, and they sort of rose above that until they felt as if they had momentarily touched God. It was a mystical experience that they had together. And then he wonders, is that thing that we experienced for one moment, is that what the saints experience uninterruptedly? We were interrupted immediately. But is that what the saints are promised after death? And then in book 11, he says he'd like to talk about Aristotle's puzzle. Is time real? The past is gone. The future isn't yet here. The present is a sizeless dot. None of the parts of time seem to exist. How are we to solve that? And his solution is, look, if the past was a mental state, like memory, and the future was a mental state, like expectation, and the present was another mental state, perhaps they could all exist in the mind. Now, I'm not sure whether that speculation works, but I think it lies behind what he goes on to say in the last 2 books, 12 and 13, which aren't very easy to read, but they're trying to describe heaven. And he says that although God's totally outside of time, some of the lower beings are sort of partly outside of time. And I wonder whether his idea is they're so wrapped in contemplation of God, which he does explicitly say, that they have no memory of this life and no thoughts about the future. And so they've shed the past and they've shed the future. And that's the way in which humans, if they're saints, rapt in the contemplation of God, might escape time. It's funny, he's a terribly torn and emotional person because he desperately hopes that that friend he lost will remember him from heaven. And he desperately doesn't want to be severed from his mother. He's torn in two directions. But he's also attracted to this semi-timelessness in which you've shed past and future by shedding expectation and memory. There was an edition of the work in the last century which stopped at chapter 9 because it thought, what's all this philosophy about? The nice story seems to have been interrupted now by philosophical interruptions. But you see, it's brilliantly planned. It, of course, is a very nice story, but it merges into the philosophy. He's telling you about his future as he is trying to predict it, as well as his past, his future even in the next life. And the philosophy comes in more and more. That's enough on number 4. Number 5. Gresham College has very generously supported the publication of this one, and I can show you the title pages. The first 2 volumes, it's only half of it because it's big, of something that will be out by Christmas with the help of Gresham College. It's a work by the most brilliant 6th century philosopher, I believe, not very much known about 20 years ago. His name is Philoponus, well known to some of the people in the room. Galileo, in his early works, mentions Philoponus more often than he mentions Plato. He completely transformed dynamics. Thomas Kuhn, one of the great historians of science, said it was a scientific revolution when, in the 14th century, as he believed, some Latin medieval person invented an idea called impetus. Nonsense. It was invented in the 6th century AD in Greek by Philoponus. It was transmitted to the 14th century through the Arabs writing in Arabic. This is the sort of discovery that's coming out from the publication of these volumes. Now, I'm not going to talk about his dynamics now, but I'm just going to tell you, or in many cases remind you, of what some people have heard before, that 529 AD was a remarkable year in the struggle between Christianity and paganism, because the Christian emperor, now moved from Rome in the time of Constantine to Constantinople, closed down the pagan Neoplatonist school in Athens. He was fed up with it. And in the same year, 529, Philoponus, who'd previously been, though a Christian, writing commentaries on Aristotle in the ordinary pagan Greek style, he comes out with a full frontal attack on the most famous of the Athenian pagan Neoplatonist philosophers, Proclus. It's called Against Proclus, on the eternity of the universe, and he's arguing that Christianity is right in its really unique view that very few people have taken, either in the pagan Greek world or in India for that matter. It's a very unusual view that the world had an absolute beginning, was created out of nothing. Nothing preceded the beginning of the world. Very unusual view, but Philoponus is going to support it. And he's going to say the pagan Proclus in Athens was wrong because it can be proved that the universe had a beginning. And the proof is that all the pagans have agreed with Aristotle that you can't have a more than finite number of years. It just follows that the universe must have had a beginning and that Christianity must be right against the pagans. Otherwise, there would already have been a more than finite number of years. It's a very brilliant proof. I think there was a satisfactory... I think the Arabs were the ones who discovered the answer to it, about before 900 AD. Grosseteste, the first Chancellor of Oxford University, knew, but I think only from Arab sources in translation, that there was something wrong. Only in the 14th century, I think, did the Latin West manage to see how to answer it. It's a very clever argument. Some of you have heard it before. Well, that will be available by Christmas, the first half in 2 volumes of Philoponus Against Proclus on the Eternity of the World. Now my last one. Almost the same date, 524 AD. Another person who was both a Christian and a Neoplatonist, by temperament anyhow. Boethius. Boethius and his Consolation of Philosophy. Many translations. You can get this, however, you can get this in the Lerb volume. I didn't bring the Lerb up. You can get Boethius in the Lerb volume. You can get everything in the Lerb volumes except for the two which have been done in our series, which Gresham is supporting. Now, what happened was this. Boethius was an aristocratic employee of the emperor, who, after the sack of Rome, was an Ostrogoth and had moved the court from Rome to Ravenna on the other side of Italy. And Boethius had a great project to translate for the Latin world Plato and Aristotle in entirety and write commentaries in Latin, but in the Greek style, on Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately, he'd only completed the logical works and some logical commentaries, logical works of Aristotle and some logical commentaries, when, at the age of 45, with his project incomplete, he was executed on a dubious political charge. The result was that the Latin world was delayed by 600 years. I sometimes thought of this when we had governments who were hostile to philosophy. 600 years, I thought, we only have to wait. We take the long view in philosophy. The Latin world had to wait 600 years before that philosophy became available to it at the end of the 12th century. It was the Islamic world that took over in a most wonderful way, the most glorious Islamic philosophers. And of course, if I'd been going beyond the first 1100 years, I would have included some Islamic philosophers who, like the Jewish philosophers, are part and parcel, this may be heretical, of the Western tradition. It's one conversation, which is not to say they are derivative in any way. They are absolutely brilliant, and they took philosophy further. I have to say that when the Athenian philosophers' school was closed in 529 AD, where did the Athenian philosophers escape to? They escaped to a palace just below Baghdad, to the safety of a Persian king who loved philosophy and encouraged them to teach their Greek philosophy to the Persians. And the front of the palace is standing to this day. I was terrified it would be bombed, but I believe it has not been, and it is still standing. The Persians played a role in saving a part of Greek philosophy for us. Now, back to Boethius. Boethius, in prison, suddenly fallen from grace, wrote this wonderful work, part in prose, part in verse, called The Consolation of Philosophy, about whether life is governed by fate, by providence, or by chance. And the interesting thing is that he relates providence very closely to chance and relates both of them to Aristotle's account of a coincidence. So we're going round full circle now, back to Aristotle. Aristotle's account of a coincidence shows how providence works, shows how chance works. These are not entirely independent alternatives. He does one more thing. He takes up a Neoplatonist idea that knowledge and the known don't necessarily have the same status. Knowledge takes its status from the knower, not from the known. So you can have definite knowledge of what is indefinite. And the example that Boethius takes is, why shouldn't you have timeless knowledge of what is temporal? So now one of the things that worried us at the beginning, might everything you're going to be doing tomorrow be fixed already? That can arise from considerations about causes, but it can arise if God knows already what you're going to do. If God already knows what you can do tomorrow, how can you do otherwise? But if God is provident for us, cares for us, is looking after us, surely he is going to know what's going to happen tomorrow, everything about it. So in being provident for us, isn't he robbing us of our freedom to do otherwise? Now, Boethius' idea comes from the Neoplatonists, but it's a very brilliant new use of their idea. He says, look, God is infallible, so you can't so act as to make him wrong. It doesn't make any sense to think that God's going to be wrong. If he also had foreknowledge of what you were going to do, your actions tomorrow would be fixed, because it would be too late so to act that he'd had a different view about what you were going to do. It would be too late. It would be irrevocable that he'd already formed the view that you were going to do this and that tomorrow. But too late doesn't make sense with God. Already doesn't make sense with God, because God created time, and therefore he's completely outside time. He doesn't have foreknowledge, he has timeless knowledge. And timeless knowledge is not a threat to your freedom tomorrow, because it's not too late. That doesn't make sense. It's not too late so to act that God's timeless view as to your conduct tomorrow is this rather than that. Well, you may wonder whether the argument's right. I certainly think it's a very brilliant argument. And that's the sixth and last of my books. Now, I've deliberately left a little time for discussion because I want to ask you some questions. I want to see what your preferences are in philosophy. You see, we started with a very scientific text. Aristotle is quite a strict scientist. He was discussing causation, 4 types of explanation, time, space, infinity, motion. These are very rigorous subjects about the nature of the physical world, closest perhaps to what we nowadays think of as science, rigorous. And yet, we've also talked about life and human predicaments and suddenly being thrown in prison and inconsolable sorrow at the loss of a friend and what the next life might be like. We've talked about all sorts of things which touch us as persons. The one thing I want to draw attention to is that these are not unconnected. Philosophy is such a ramifying subject that one topic affects another. I've deliberately made our lectures over the 3 years very varied, because I think if you just talk about ethics, you won't have a broad base from which to discuss them. I'm sure you'll be able to throw most important light on them, but the broader the base, the better, because in philosophy everything interconnects. And a purely scientific treatise, or a very scientific treatise, like Aristotle's, full of rigor, can be extremely relevant to what seem more personal and also more vague questions about how to face life and its problems. These are interconnected. Now, I think what I'd like to ask you first is whether you have any preference among the 6 books, if you can remember them, I'll rename them, that we've talked about, and whether you have any preference as between the scientific questions of motion and time and space and the questions about life and how to deal with its problems. But first, let me try and collect some votes. Aristotle's rigorous physics, time, space, motion, infinity, and cause. Any buyers? You don't have to vote at all, but I'm just interested. Yes, it's most interesting to see. I've got a sprinkling. It's pretty tough stuff, but I've got more than half a dozen. Now, my two Stoics on whom I cheated, the first century AD Stoics, Seneca's the easier one. Epictetus will prepare you for torture and prison camp, and some people absolutely love him. I prefer to think I shall avoid prison camp with any luck, and so I'd rather read Seneca on the rat race. But these are my 2 Stoics. Who would vote for at least one of those? A larger number. How interesting. May I just count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's quite big. 10, 11, 12. Thank you. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. Almost worth writing it down, actually. It's so interesting. All right. So we had 6 plus, and then we had 23. Now my next one was the complete history up to that point in 300 AD of the debate of whether it's all right to kill animals or not all right. Book 1, so-called, it's only 20 pages, records the other side, that it is all right. Now, Any takers for Porphyry on abstinence from killing animals? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think 5. Very interesting, right? We've got 5 there. Now, my next one is the Confessions, rightly named. Wonderful title. The Confessions, and I'm very sorry to those downstairs that I can't see what their votes are, but if somebody downstairs would like to take account, I shall be very interested to see. Maybe downstairs the atmosphere is completely different and you'll vote differently. Now, St. Augustine Confessions, any takers? Now, that quite surprises me. I'm going to count. 1, 2, 3, only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, I thought that would have a lot of takers. I offered it to one of my daughters, but I got turned down. So perhaps this, I need to think why. So that was about 5, wasn't it? Now, I didn't tell you very much today about this chap who he really provided an alternative to Aristotelian science, a Christianizing alternative. Science was all changed around from Aristotle so as to make the creation of the world, a finite amount of time ago, the centerpiece of science. That was when all these special dynamic forces were implanted into the universe. And it had the advantage that Aristotle had explained different types of motion in different ways, but Philoponus explained them all the same way. It's hard to make that convincing in a very short space of time, though some of you have heard about him before. Any takers at all on Philoponus? Oh, good. Well, I have got 2. Well, that's good. All right. We've got 2. Now, which of you, like Alfred the Great and Elizabeth I, are going to vote for Boethius? Let me tell you that Alfred paraphrased this in the most appalling way to suit his own political purposes. So I wouldn't call these translations, but at least they were paraphrases and they inspired 2 of our sovereigns. Anybody lining up with the sovereigns for Boethius' consolation? A fair number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's coming out the second highest, but the overwhelming preference, how very interesting, was my 2 Stoics. Was that a result of my cheating and offering you 2 for the price of 1? I'm sorry? Would you make a second ballot to see who was for Seneca? Who was for Seneca? The gentler one, rat race one. Oh, that is a very substantial number. Who was for Epictetus? Who will... Right, okay, more were for Seneca. I'd recommend Seneca more. Epictetus did say some terrible things. He said that when each time you kissed your wife and child, you should remember I'm kissing a mortal. I could make that sound better than it sounds first off. And he defends it very vigorously indeed and says nobody in this room has true love unless they adopt this attitude, because all of them could become jealous. And only his attitude avoids jealousy. Nonetheless, it's a bit too much for me. Okay, so Seneca is clearly the winner. Right, now, do you have a feeling about whether what you most like about philosophy is it's addressing, as it most certainly does, how we are going to confront life, or it's addressing problems about the nature of the universe which are absolutely fascinating in their own right? First, let's take what I'm guessing is going to be the minority. By all means, show me wrong. Who likes the sort of scientific side about the nature of the physical universe? Who's voting for that? Quite a few. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Very good. 15 for the physical side of the universe. Who likes the bits of philosophy which address the predicaments of life? A huge majority. A huge majority. Right, very interesting. Why? We've got 3 minutes. Why? Any thoughts?
Well,
yes.
Rational thinkers and so forth.
I'll repeat the comment.
The whole question of that we are feeling and emotional beings comes to an end. Now, much more particularly Antonio Damasio and people like that, American neurobiologists, are coming forward with this sort of view.
A very interesting comment's been made. Very interesting because it combines the two sides, the scientific and the life side. Because what's being said, and it's perfectly true, is that neurobiologists are increasingly turning to study emotions. Damasio is an important example. Of course, those who come from that direction are probably start with an interest in the science. But it's true, and it's high time that they studied emotions. My feeling about Damasio is precisely this, that it is incredibly important to know about the physical side of emotions. They have a physical side, but I don't agree with him when he purports to be explaining the thinky side of emotions. And this goes back to Aristotle saying we've got to understand the form as well as the matter. But I'm very much fascinated by the material side, which he's thrown a lot of light on. And I think it's extremely interesting. Any other comments? Yes, thank you. I'll repeat this. Yes?
Sorry. Is it a fair duality as you've presented it? We have to choose between the scientific and human interest philosophy about moral issues or other issues. Of course, apart from your own answer to that, but the two can interconnect. But there's also surely a whole school of philosophy which believes that philosophy is primarily about understanding meaning, and that goes into all kinds of different fields.
Understanding being, did
meaning.
you say? Being.
Meaning, yes.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
I'm talking now about Wittgenstein and analytic philosophy after that, but
Understanding
both.
being, yes. Putting it this way goes back perhaps to Aristotle, because he said that after studying physics, he's just talking about the order of study, not the order of importance necessarily, but after studying physics, you ought to study being. And that's the sort of question here is, what are the most fundamental beings in the universe? Are they atoms? Are they minds? What is the most fundamental sort of thing in the universe? Is it matter? Is it form? What is the most fundamental sort of being in the universe is what you read after physics. And then the word got coined metaphysics, meaning what you think about after you've read about the physics. I think the physics is a little bit easier to think about. Then you think about what are the most fundamental beings. That's the study of metaphysics. Neither of these are spirituality, which you also mentioned. One thing I might say about both Indian philosophy and Greek philosophy is that increasingly the Greeks thought more and more each century that the sort of philosophy we've been doing needs to be combined with imaginative exercises. One week I lectured about if, as Derek Parfit said, and some Buddhists have said, we were just streams of consciousness, would there be any sufferers? Can streams of consciousness suffer? Would there be any compassion? Can there be anybody who feels compassion, or any sufferer for whom compassion is felt, if there are only streams of consciousness? Now, the Buddhists, some of them, not only studied the intellectual question, which we talked about, but performed exercises of imagination. One of the Buddhist saints imagined the unflattering perspective from which his colleagues in the monastery viewed him, and thought sympathetically about how life would feel to them looking at him. And his view was that it's one thing to say, look, we can prove we're only streams of consciousness, there's no self, so there's no intellectual reason to be frightened of losing yourself when you die, but that's also intellectual. You've also got to perform the imaginative exercises to make yourself feel that way. And it's only if you feel compassion, even for these imaginary other selves, that you will really feel that you've got no self to lose. There's no such thing as a self. There's only streams of consciousness. The later Greeks increasingly, and the Indians, all felt that philosophy, as we've done it, should be combined with these exercises of the imagination. That's one place where spirituality would come in. Sorry, it was rather long on that. Now, have we got time? I think we are at time. I'm going, in any case, to invite the people downstairs to put a few questions to me immediately afterwards. So that will also apply to those up here, but I better allow those downstairs to ask the first one or two. Now it's time for me to stop. Thank you very much indeed for coming in such numbers.